2, 1.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Multimodal Connect series of webinars. Today we're going to be discussing the role of ports and the supply chain in the 21st century. We have a stellar lineup of panelists to help you today, and I'm going to be handing over to your chairman to introduce the panel in a second. On the Swapcard platform, you'll be able to post your questions, and I would like you to start doing those when the moment comes, and we will do our very best to answer as many of those questions as we can in the 90 minutes that we have. It's a challenging time for everybody for a whole number of reasons, and for sure we're going to be touching on COVID and Brexit and port capacity. But also, if you have questions looking more to the future, they would be very welcome as well. This is not just about the here and now. Well, we know we can't avoid that, but we hope to take a look into the future and paint a picture for you as well. So I'm going to be handing over to Frank Rowbottom now. Frank has spent 40 years in the transportation business with Mersey Docks and Harbour Board, Peel Ports, ABP, and he has been an advisor to numerous companies throughout his career. At the moment, he is a board member of Mersey Maritime, and rumour has it he knows something about Freeports as well, which will no doubt come into the conversation. So, Frank, can I hand things over to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Robert. We've all missed live concerts in the last 12 months with COVID and the like. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce a super group of logistics, transport and shipping rock stars here tonight or this afternoon. So with great pleasure, can I introduce Gary Jeffries, 20 years experience in the deep sea container business, and now Chief Executive of CMA UK, based here in Liverpool. So welcome, Gary. And we have John Williams, from Maritime Transport, Executive Chairman. John lives and breathes the trucking industry and now the rail industry. It's totally within his DNA and is at the forefront of many new initiatives in the industry. We've got John Smith, the founder of GB Rail Freight, a great innovator in the rail industry. Large parts of the industry, from a freight perspective, have been changed because of the enthusiasm, the innovation, and the challenges that John has relished taking on. So it's a great pleasure to have John with us. And then we have Stephen Carr. Stephen, now with Peel Ports as the Commercial and Marketing Director, leading some fantastic schemes at the Port of Liverpool, which I've been attached to for a long time in my working career. And it's great to see it blossoming even more as we go forward with the new rail, with the new container terminal and the way rail services are developing. So we have a fantastic group of people with us here today, and we look forward to people's questions to test the experience and knowledge of our panel members. So can we have the first question, please, Robert?
Yes. In view of what is currently going on in ports and the wider supply chain at the moment, how are the companies looking forwards, and what sort of measures are they starting to think about to improve resilience in their operations?
Can we have a first question to John, please? John Williams.
Right, thank you, Frank. Yes, so what we are doing, and we've been doing it for some time, is to decompress the size of fleets based at ports and to move them inland. And up until last year, the inland locations would have been connected by overnight trucks, connecting the port to the inland terminal or the inland depot. Since April last year, since we took over DB Cargo's intermodal interests, we now have 5 rail terminals that are rail connected. So our strategy is to evacuate our volume from the ports to the inland terminals and then do the first and final mile from the terminal. So that's the way that we are trying to deal with the future. I think that's going to help us to recruit drivers, because recruiting drivers to do localized transport, so doing days and night shifts, this is more appealing to especially younger drivers and female drivers, whereas trying to recruit drivers to spend all week away in their cabs, so-called trampers, and staying at motorway truck stops and so on. This is the type of driver that's aging and very, very difficult to replace. I think also localizing transport allows alternative fuels to be more realistic, so that they don't rely on a national network of refueling sites, say for whatever the next alternative fuel becomes, whether it's hydrogen or electrification.
Okay, thank you, John. Can we pass that question then on to John Smith, please? Thanks,
Frank. Yeah, I think some of it dovetails in with what John has described. Actually, we found our business. Well, if you look at rail at the moment, I think rail is roughly about 30% of the carriage of all deep sea boxes imported and exported into the UK. It varies across the ports, but not greatly. For us at GB Rail Freight, we're only 25 of that 30. So there's a massive opportunity to dovetail into what John says. I think recent issues have highlighted the need to move volume quickly from the ports into the inland terminals that John has highlighted. From our perspective, in terms of building in resilience to that, we need more kit. We need efficient kit that gets you more TEU per foot of train, which we're currently investing in. And we need people to help us as well. We need the capacity on the network. There's a little bit of irony that COVID has created, whereby passenger always ruled the roost on the railways, necessarily so from a political point of view. And most of the ports that we operate from, the freight trains come out onto what have been very busy passenger railways. So the issue of capacity and the issue of infrastructure investment in more capacity on the rail network has been particularly important for us. I think one of the challenges that I'm addressing at the moment with government relates to the fact that Network Rail has had its enhancement budget cut from 10 billion to 9 billion, not a huge cut, you would argue. And previously, when this has taken place, it's normally been the freight enhancements that have been sacrificed. And we've got to make sure that that doesn't happen, so that we have the capacity to deal with the increased number of trains. But I certainly see growth in rail freight on intermodal. It's grown dramatically during GB Rail Freight's history, and I see that continuing. And from the carbon agenda's point of view, it has to continue.
Okay. Can I pass the question now on to Gary? Because out of the panel members, Gary is involved in a global organization. So he can not only give an answer in response to the question that has a UK context, but also a global context, if you don't mind, Gary.
Sure. Thanks, Frank, and thanks for the introduction today. Good to be here. So I think for us, we've seen a significant swing in demand for our services from one half of the year to the next. And it really has been a game of two halves. So significant decrease, obviously, early in 2020 with many countries on lockdown. And an unprecedented increase in demand from Q3 onwards. That has meant we've had to build additional capacity into our network. So as a comparison, for example, in Asia-Europe, we'll have an additional 25% capacity year on year from Q1 19 to Q1 2021. And obviously there's been issues with the whole infrastructure being able to cope with that. So we have to be innovative when it comes to using different ways of getting cargo in and out of the UK. And we continue to invest, as I think all are, in different products, whether that be using feeders or relay products and different options in the UK. But for sure, this has been a very unique year. Like I said, unprecedented demands on the back of the UK coming out of lockdown, and so therefore we need to continue to invest in innovative products, different solutions, different modes of transport to give customers options in and out of the UK. From a global perspective, it is very difficult when you run such a fixed asset-based organisation to be able to flex demand in the way supply and demand as we have seen throughout 2020 because, again, of the unprecedented nature of this pandemic. And that has meant that we have had to be as agile as possible, which has not always met customer demands, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure we'll get onto some of that today. And so, yeah, we look forward actually to some stability to be able to offer the service the customers expect from us.
It's great that you say, even from a global perspective, Gary, that you look forward to some certainty. I mean, in this era, I can't remember when there's been so many challenges thrown at our industry in such a short space of time, and it's great to hear the optimism that still you all have in looking forward to the future. And from Stephen's point of view, which is the question going to now, Stephen's running an asset that can't move. You are all very agile. You know, you can move either from a national perspective or from a global perspective. And Steve is responsible for an asset in the port of Liverpool that is fixed. So he has to be agile in his own mentality to deal with some of the challenges. So if you can then see how you can respond to Stephen, I'd be really grateful for that.
Yeah, certainly. I think actually that question of resilience that Robert referred to is one that we've probably talked about for some time, and those investments that you refer to, Frank, in the introductory remarks stemmed from a view that we felt that the UK was just too reliant on too few assets in the south and east of the UK, and that's what's driven a number of those investments. And what we've seen over the last 6 months is a beginning of a trend towards supply chains behaving differently. Certainly, if you look at whether it's reactions to COVID and the impacts they've had on supply chain, or whether it's planning ahead for exiting the single market, we've certainly seen new services. And I don't just mean new container services, we've seen new ferry services come through all ports. We've also seen new rail connections start from the port as well, which you referred to. And I think whilst these are being driven by critical here and now matters, it's easy to overlook the fact that there are other drivers at play here. And as we return to some form of normality at some point next year, hopefully, you know, issues that we need to address are matters such as the environment, supply chain resilience, reliability in supply chain. And I think what would have happened over the last 12 months will make people question those models that we've had for a generation and deploy new models. You know, and Gary was talking about new relay products, new feeder products as ways of connecting through. And I think the way that supply chains will work in the future will exploit not just our assets outside of that traditional cluster, but also those of our competitors on the East Coast as well.
Okay. Thanks for that, chaps. There's a lot of food for thought there. And I think that some of the comments that will recur again with the questions that follow as we get into the nitty-gritty of the session. So I'd welcome now another question, please, Robert.
Yes, this one is, I suppose there's reference to Brexit with this. But what help or change in regulations from the UK government would the panel be welcoming in terms of how they can improve your customers' supply chain, but also your own individual operations?
Can I go to that question to John Smith, please, if that's okay, John?
Yeah, I think I welcome that they do a deal of some description so that we all understood how on earth the thing is going to work. I think the uncertainty at the moment isn't helpful. As I as I've said many times, you know, no deal Brexit, you've still got to get a deal. There has to be a deal. You know, nothing changes on the 1st of January other than we've got to get round the table with our European partners again to try and clarify how we're going to trade between us. And actually at that point, our negotiating leverage is probably long since gone. So I somewhat despair of what is taking place at the moment. Not the decision, just the way that this has been managed. You know, and after whatever it is, 1,600 days since the vote, here we are 20 days out waiting for a deal to be done. I think for us, we operate through the Channel Tunnel, which I fear that during the early stages of Brexit, we'll probably see ports blockaded in Calais. We'll probably see burning tyres in the forefoot of railway lines that prevents us operating those services. So I think in the short term, that worries me. But I just wish I knew how the trading was going to work. And then we, as privateers, I guess, could seek to exploit that situation. It may even be good for rail if the ports are going to get glued up with lorries going through Dover and Calais, and rail can offer a solution in not an unsimilar way to what's taken place with the deep sea ports here, where we're cascading big volumes into the centre of the country, and then the road hauliers are exploiting better utilisation of their equipment in the centre. So I just welcome an understanding of what on earth is going on, Frank.
But taking that point up, John, Brexit is creating such uncertainty for all of us, and how you plan a business going forward at the present moment is a challenge in itself. But if you had a wish list of certain things that the government could do, irrespective of Brexit and other issues, what kind of regulated change would you want them to prioritise? Or has the concentration on the current challenges actually not given you time to think about what they could be doing for the longer term benefits of the network that you're involved in?
Was that me or John Williams?
That's for you, John. That's for you to just carry on with your conversation, because point there.
Yeah, wish list is difficult to judge. I mean, there's issues around tariffs and how trade will operate. It's a bit like Gary was saying. I mean, I don't think any of us would have expected the lull in volumes on container ships this year, and then the dramatic rise, which is obviously being driven by some economic dynamic. I'm not sure that it's always shopping at home, but the more you understand about the background to these things, the more easily you can prepare for it. And similar to Gary, we don't have assets sat around. We have to get high utilization, and they don't come cheap. They're not quite as expensive as ships. So just understanding how trade is going to take place, and where there's going to be strengths and weaknesses in those relationships, and where the Jaguar Land Rover are going to move all their production to the Czech Republic and out of Solihull. Just some understanding of how the thing is going to work, because then we can plan for where we might exploit. Stuff is still going to need to be moved. We'll still be buying cars. We'll still be booking stuff on Amazon. So I think for us, I feel reasonably comfortable, but I have no idea how the economy is going to manage these things. So in terms of wish list, it is just a little bit of clarity around how trading will work and how the tariffs are going to operate in each direction. Okay.
Well, then, can you complement then John's comments, please, John Williams?
Well, I think the issues facing us is that all the equipment that we own and operate is imported either from Germany or Holland or Scandinavia. So here we are looking at a situation where we don't know what the tariffs are going to be on importing trucks and reach stackers and empty container handlers. So we've tried to anticipate a worst case scenario by acquiring 250 trucks, which are arriving this month and up until March, where we're trying to fix the price. But beyond that, we could be looking at a 10% increase on the cost of a Scania or a Volvo or a Mercedes-Benz. In terms of reach stackers, they're circa 400,000 euros each. And we probably need to buy 8 next year. We need to buy 4 straddle carriers, and I think they're about 750,000 euros. So the cost of acquiring this equipment is potentially it's already very expensive, but facing higher duty is going to make it more expensive. The other issue that we face, obviously, is the supply of drivers. Non-British Europeans underpin the entire supply chain, whether it's the distribution centres or driving vans for Amazon or driving our trucks. We don't employ any agency or temporary drivers, and haven't done since 2004. So we see a pure statistic every week of drivers who leave, drivers who are arriving. And the number of non-British Europeans in my company is less than 15%, but it's falling. So this is the biggest challenge, I think, that we face. And I think one of the questions that's probably going to come up is, what are we doing to recruit, to retrain, to increase the number of drivers? And that is such a difficult subject to deal with, because we're seeing a situation at the moment where not many non-British Europeans have decided to apply for settled status. So we'll have to see how the workforce emerges into 2021. But as far as training our drivers, we have a situation where we're contributing to what's called the apprenticeship levy, which is a surcharge on the payroll. And I can't remember how long it's been in place, but I think probably 4 or 5 years. And as an industry, the transport industry has contributed £500 million into this fund. And I think the transport industry has been able to claim about 50 million out of it, which is a tiny amount. And as a company, Maritime, we've contributed £1.5 million to the apprenticeship levy, and we've claimed £12,000. So we're not given a chance on how to train our drivers, because we're at the 26-ton payload, 44-ton gross vehicle weight. So a driver needs his rigid license and then the articulated license. The cost of putting one of these drivers through to get both licenses is probably between £5,000 or £6,000. But you can't claim this through the levy.
So, but how then? What solution for that? I know we're not particularly driver shortages at the present moment, John, but because you've raised it in such a way with facts there, how are you seeing that? How are you seeing the challenge resolved, or is it just literally to your own efforts that you'll try to solve it to maintain your own customer service levels?
Well, you focus on what you can do, and I think we have switched focus from recruitment to retention, and to try and stop drivers from leaving. Why are they leaving us? Okay, some are retiring, but we are looking at improving, strategies and tactics to retain our drivers over the longer term.
Okay.
And the way that we look to increase is to expand our network so that we're creating a depot at a location where we not previously were. So we're fresh into the area. But in terms of the seaports, your back's to the sea, you're not in the center of anywhere. So the size of your market is smaller and the amount of competition is much greater.
Yeah, okay. But it has, on that one, John, though, has the explosion of online retailing and distribution, which has brought many van drivers into the industry, hasn't that had even just a marginal benefit in getting people used to being or using the industry as a career?
Potentially, and you'd hope so, but actually it can have the opposite effect where, British drivers into their 60s might decide that they don't want to go for a medical, they don't want to work 70 hours a week, they don't want to hang around in ports, but they still want to earn money and drive a vehicle. So they can easily go and drive a van. Okay, it's not exactly easy work either. Sometimes they're handling 30, 40, 50 parcels in a shift. So that's not for everybody. But it can work the other way, where drivers have got, we're creating more driving jobs. And with online, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that actually it creates an additional full load transport leg in a lot of cases. You've got the first mile, middle mile, and final mile. So that's creating much more demand for warehousing and for transport, full loads and vans.
Not to take up too much conversation now on that issue, to Stephen, and when we talk about regulatory and we talk about Brexit, there's the Port of Liverpool and its involvement in Irish trade, which is an extremely sensitive subject at this moment in time. Can you elaborate on the question, if you don't mind, Stephen? We can't hear Stephen, can we?
Sorry, is that better, Frank?
Yeah.
Sorry, I owe everybody a pint now for not taking my phone off mute in time. Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, John's just mentioned that sitting in ports all day might not be glamorous. I've got it outside every day, so it's one to look forward to there. But I think that point about regulation and what regulations would you want to move, I think there's two issues. One in terms of the very short term, here and now, and there are so many people who because of how the Brexit debate is being played out in the media, thinks there's a level of uncertainty. And of course, whilst a trade deal is very important, in the short term, it doesn't change what happens unless we decide to stay in the single market. Come the 1st of January, there will be a requirement to change processes and paperwork. And one of my big fears is that because it's being played out, will there be a deal or not, is people aren't making decisions and some people aren't making preparations. And so I have a very short-term desire to see is people understand that things are going to change. The second area that concerns me is that there's, to a certain extent, there's a reliance back to physical paperwork for some of these transactions that are taking place. And the idea of there being a COVID environment and hauliers being required to present paperwork to desks, even if it's only for a small proportion of traffic, fills me with fear. The model that works through container terminals today for countries outside of the EU works very well. It works digitally. There's very little human interactions. It works smoothly, and my ask would be that we develop those automated transactions for every single transaction, and not just for the majority. And I think that's because there's been a focus on the Dover-Calais route, which is obviously a very very high percentage of accompanied drivers on that route. And I really wonder if one of our solutions for the supply chain of the future is using unaccompanied transport for a far greater leg of the journey. So as John was just saying earlier, can we use rail to get product into the middle of the country and then use those hauliers effectively for that smaller journey? And I do think that's something that we should try and see encourage more, is to use that scarcity of labour for bigger volumes where possible. So use rail for, and let's make rail more economic for shorter journeys. Let's use our coastal shipping model more. And then I think, coming back to that question of Ireland, I think because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, that's got to be implemented, or up until this week, that was due to be implemented on the 1st of January. For governments of both sides to think it's reasonable on industry to present the solution with 21 days to go is mind-blowing. And how people, how retailers, how manufacturers can be expected to get their supply chains ready in such a short space of time suggests to me that people don't really understand the complexities of how supply chains work. So there's a whole mix of issues in there, but you put all of that together, and it's about, for me, it's about regulations are currently being created by people who don't really understand how the industry works.
Yeah. And thank you, Steve. And the point that you just raised there about changing shipping services, what was fascinating is the announcement and the success that you've had with the CLDN service, the Ro-Ro services coming up from Iberia. Who would have thought that even 10 years ago? And now it's happening. And one part of it is commercial. There's a justified need for it. And the other issue, is it because it's trying to avoid the bottlenecks around the south of England to establish those services, complementary to container services? So, and I think what's going on the Irish Sea is particularly interesting at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of elements there that's worth just a bit of further investigation. The CLDN ferry service that started up was that a precursor to potential delays at ports, across the channel, or was it because that driver shortage that John's talked about there is equally apparent on the continent? And actually, did COVID and the concerns that the Spanish haulage community have about that long distance driving through France to come to the UK accelerate that issue? So is it a post-COVID issue? Is it a pre-Brexit issue? We don't know. But what's happened is CLDN have spotted that opportunity for freight to move on wheels, but move by longer distance maritime routes. Equally interesting, although maybe less attractive for us on Irish seaports within Britain are the new services that are starting between Ireland and the continent. So this role that Britain has played as a land bridge between Ireland and the continent in the past, that there are more services that are starting to show direct services there with Britain being cut out of that leg. So there is plenty of evidence out there that services and models are changing. And I think for me, what we want to see from government is a regulatory framework, an administrative framework that minimises bureaucracy, that enables these new models to flow with as little intervention as possible and let the systems do the work. And
Gary, with Gary's got, again, the global perspective of what we see here and the impact of Brexit and UK regulatory change. But he's also got it from a short sea perspective because of CMA operating container ships. And it would be interesting to get your observations, please, Gary, on the question.
Sure, thank you. So I think firstly, I just want to reiterate Stephen's point around this bureaucracy. I think what we need to do is make sure that it is as easy as possible post-Brexit. I think the industry over the past sort of 5 to 10 years has come a long way in terms of automation. And it's really important that we don't go back to masses of paperwork which will hold up cargo and ultimately get to the consumers. Yeah, on the question of short sea, absolutely. Container ships is a huge part of our group. It's one that we continue to invest in. We certainly see opportunities post-Brexit in terms of additional volumes on short sea. There's a lot of research to suggest that customers are going to intra-regionalize their supply chains more. But that's not a new concept. It's one that's been existing for a while. I think it could be accelerated with COVID and certainly for us with Brexit. So the market will keep in, the market is untapped actually and it's huge on the short sea side. So it's one we are opening new products every week with container ships. And I can only see that will continue to grow in 2021.
Okay. I'm conscious now that we're quite a conversation debate going on with individual questions. So I think there's probably now a backup of questions coming forward. So could we have the next question, please, Robert?
Yes, and I'd just like to remind everybody to post their questions on Swapcard. And if you see a question that someone else has posed and you like it, you can give it a little thumbs up and then we'll know it's one that we definitely should pose to the panel. This one's from Richard Newton. And he would like to know from the panel, how can we as an industry convince shippers to ship containers on a door bill of lading so they can be routed by rail or sea closer to the point of consumption? Would this ease the congestion at the hub ports and use resources all over the UK?
This question has to go to Gary first of all.
Thank you. So I think with any supply chain, predictability is always an advantage. So for many years, we have been trying to encourage, where possible, to get as much information around the final destination of the cargo as possible. And we have seen improvements of that. with that, without a doubt. Now we get a lot more information up front around where we ultimately need to deliver the cargo to. I think the issue is sometimes flexibility. So our customers rightly want the option to be able to flex when it comes to consumers. And of course, as we see with the online and e-commerce channels increasing all the time, then consumer habits, demands, where we need to put the cargo ultimately in the UK does change. It does change from the moment it's shipped. So I think that without a doubt, we would welcome it, of course, and it will assist us in working with partners that are on the panel today to make sure we can get things moved quicker and potentially ease congestion. But we also have to realise that the world is changing and consumer demands are changing, and therefore we have to offer flexibility as well.
On that, Gary, is because there's been so much innovation with IT systems that the deep sea container lines have introduced and will continue to introduce. That is going to open up even more flexibility because you want to offer the perfect service of choice. Does it become counterproductive in the end to offer so much choice that the complexity is put into the system, even though the systems themselves can create efficiencies?
I think it's a good question. I think there's always a balance between complexity and being able to be flexible and offer and meet customer demands. So to answer the question, no, I think absolutely we need to continue as an industry to go down the road of making sure we've got innovative solutions, especially in the UK, to ensure that we can keep cargo flowing to our customers. But yes, we need to have a balance to ensure that it's something that we can consistently deliver on.
And if we can go to John, because John, with both a trucking hat on and a rail hat on, how do you see that question, John, being resolved? Obviously, you'd like to have more certainty where the cargo is going to go when it arrives at the port. But do you want to be in a situation where you can say to a client, like the shipping line, that we can offer flexibility to you about end destinations?
Yes, but it also starts at the terminal. If the terminal is able to segregate what could go by rail and what may not go by rail, so say by road, if it can segregate the stacks and the discharge at that point and have the space to take the rail moves to a separate area so that there is more resource and more certainty and getting those containers nearer to the railhead, then perhaps we won't experience, the double shifting, treble shifting that's potentially going on at the port right now, and the misses that John Smith and I experience almost on a daily basis. And it's not just limited to Felixstowe either. A number of ports are missing containers on every departure, and that's wasteful and painful. So I think on the terminal, identifying what is a rail-coded move based on its destination would be very helpful for the terminal operator. And if John Smith and I can maintain higher levels of utilization on the fixed costs routes that we operate, then we can make money to invest more in the system.
Yeah, and just I'm on the system here, and I look at you, John, with your hairline, and I look at John Smith with his hairline. I can sense that somebody's having a slightly easier career at this moment in time compared to your good self, John.
I put a very big shift in, Frank, every day, and I'm only 28.
To be 28 again, John.
But then I look at Stephen Carr's head, and I'm thinking he's so young, he shouldn't have lost that much hair in any case.
I didn't know this was a fashion parade, Frank. Bloody hell.
But for that question, Stephen, where there you go with the asset, and Liverpool has been predominantly based haulage operation. Okay, we've seen again an increase in rail services. How do you see that question again, where we're trying to get the boxes through to that end destination as best and seamless as we can, with trying to encourage end-of-door bill of ladings? How do you see your role in trying to say which is the best solution for us to be able to offer the clients who are dictating flexibility?
Well, I think my hairline is best explained by trying to get John's train service started with about 2 weeks' notice about a fortnight ago. So I think we'll leave that one there.
I think it was 2 days, Stephen. As I remember.
I think there's two elements. I think firstly, can I fully support what John Williams was just saying a moment ago about getting that terminal operation smooth and efficient. And I think the more we can get our systems integrated.
Everybody can hear now, Stephen Carr. I can't.
Oh, well, I'm off mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank, have you got a hearing aid switched on?
Yeah. But the battery's going, John.
So if we assume it's Frank's problem, I'll carry on, and hopefully the sound will come back to Frank. I think what we're saying is the point that John Williams has just made a minute ago is absolutely correct, which is the more there is data visibility, so that as the container is being discharged from a ship and it's due for rail, it can be segregated, it can be shunted to rail terminals in one go. So it's ready for a quick and efficient load when the train arrives. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think coming back to the wider question of how do we create that network, if you like, and your question to me, Frank, about Liverpool's historic position as a predominant feeder port. Cargo wasn't really going more than about 50 miles from the port, and rail was inefficient as a mode of transport. As we know, it probably only becomes efficient over 100, 150 miles, something of that order. I think how we can use idle rail freight for short journeys is one we can look at in the future. But certainly as Liverpool's role changes from being a pure feeder port to having a number of direct calls, that's given shipping lines the critical mass to enable these rail services that we just talked about, the one that John started a couple of weeks ago. It starts to create the critical mass through ports like Liverpool for cargo to move out by rail freight as well. I think for me, though, to come back to that very original question, it's about the integrator, be it a shipping line offering a to-door bill of lading or the freight forwarder, understanding where that end cargo is and what the most efficient route is to get that cargo there. And it might not be through the hub ports in the southeast. It might be through Liverpool and road. It might be through a rail plus road connection. And I think the more that data can get shared through systems, and the more that all of us who play our little part in that chain can contribute to that efficient model, the more we'll achieve the goal of spreading that risk around UK ports and around multiple forms of transport as well.
Thank you, Stephen. John Smith, have you got any observations to make? It's interesting about the systems and the transparency of the systems being part of the logistics change from the ship to the port to the truck or the train or both. Have you got any comments to add, please, John?
Yeah, I guess just a couple, Frank. I mean, I've always been fascinated. It's not my business. I'm a railway person, so bills of lading and door-to-door bills of lading is a mystery to me. But equally, the other side of the coin is, despite recent problems, I've always been fascinated by how efficiently the whole thing works. But I think it is apparent to me that within those systems, there is a lot more efficiency to be gained. I don't know whether it's about integration of certain systems or whether it's about pre-nomination of cargo. I mean, I remember an exotic holiday in Vietnam when we were buying a lump of garden furniture in the back streets of Hanoi, and someone shoved a piece of paper in front of me and said, "Do I want it landed in Felixstowe, Southampton, or Teesport?" And I was thinking, how bizarre is this? Which was sort of kind of leading towards an identification of where stuff should come into. So if the systems are there, which are things that I don't understand, then certainly just from a rail perspective, I'd echo what both Stephen and John have said, which is, pre-nomination of boxes, which is what we're often pushed to by the ports. If you can pre-nominate, we can more efficiently get boxes onto trains. We can plan the loading of those trains. We get better utilization of assets. Our margins rise or our prices drop. So that efficiency is absolutely key, versus some of the complexity that's taking place at the moment. So I think that's what I'd have.
Well, can I just ask one more question of Gary on that? Gary, with your experience of ports around the world, is there an example where you use a port, that the majority of the boxes are predetermined in terms of destination?
So I think in some of the countries that we operate, where there are certainly more, for example, ramp services. So US would be one where we get a lot closer to the end user, usually up front. So US would be one, and there are some others as well as we go through the Americas. But in general, no. Still, we're operating on this kind of door to port or port to port service. I think to come back to the whole question, there's been a lot of investment and in the press around blockchain. And I think it's kind of something over the last few years where people have said, yeah, it's come in, but it doesn't necessarily impact my part of the transport chain. And actually, because there are so many people as part of this chain, from ports to shipping lines to route providers, customs authorities, will only really make that step change when we all do, I think, accept that the only way to really improve this end-to-end seamless service is that we've all got to get on board when it comes to these blockchain solutions. And, I won't be drawn or it doesn't really matter what one it is, but we are behind other industries in this sense. The technology is there for us to be able to offer a lot more visibility, which offers a lot more predictability. And that's something I think that we've all got to commit to take forward.
Okay, but that begs the question, though, Gary. CMA have brought Seaver Logistics into the frame. Does that give you greater opportunity in providing this service to the client as an integrated service to get even those more efficiencies out of understanding where the cargo is actually going to go to? So it might not even end up at the destination initially, but at least you're part of that chain from start to finish now.
Yeah, so I think obviously Steve is a part of our group, and I think there's been a lot talked about in terms of where we want to take that. Logistics companies have been part of actually the arms or groups of shipping lines for many years, and vice versa. In fact, there's many logistics companies who've got investment in shipping lines, and so I don't think it's a new phenomenon. What we realize is that, again, the world is changing, the demands of customers are different, and the sourcing is going to be different as we move forward. So therefore, we're adapting the different companies within our group to cater for that. We still have a number of, and will continue to have a number of logistics companies, freight forwarders who are major customers of ours on the shipping line side, and will be for the future. So I think it's more about that evolution and the variety of different things we want to offer to customers, rather than us necessarily trying to take over the complete visibility of the supply chain. What I'm pleased to see are things like the Digital Association, which many of us have signed up to. Where I think this week they announced that there was really a recognition around eventually doing away with the bill of lading, right? So we can have a paperless bill of lading. That's not something that one individual shipping line can do on their own. We have to move together. So I think it's actually more important, these associations where we come together, and that's why I say, as all parts of the group, to really accept that we have to move with a more digital solution in the future to be able to keep up with the demand of cargo flow around the world.
Thank you, Gary. And I think just my personal observation might not be relevant, Mark, but if there is more certainty over the movement of the container from A to B to go to the final destination, if we're all clear about that, there must be some environmental benefits as well being put into the system when you have a destination bill of lading. I hope we've answered Richard's question there to some degree, or got a flavour of what the complexity is or the problems of doing it. But now move on to the next question, please, Robert.
Yes, this is from Mark O'Reilly. The question is now the time to seriously consider rerouting more traffic to northern ports such as the Humber, etc.? And I guess the sort of kicker to that is, will shippers who have their cargo moved want to stay there? Should it be moved?
Well, this is an obvious question to go straight to Stephen, I think. So it's your platform, Stephen.
Well, yeah, I think the simple answer from my perspective is yes. Won't surprise anybody that. But I would even support what might be more surprising is and I think I referenced it earlier, that it's as much about the East Coast ports as it is the West Coast ports in the north. When you look at the geography of the UK, so much of our population, manufacturing and retail centres sit relatively close to a coastline, and yet we use so little of it for the movement of unitized freight. The obvious answer to that question is yes. I think there's a really interesting tail to that question as well, about those containers that are being moved temporarily right now as an alternative. I think to give you an idea of some of those demand pressures, so October time is generally Christmas peak for us in ports. By November, the goods are further in the supply chain, if not on the supermarket shelves. Yet despite that, the volume in November through Liverpool was about 35% higher than it was in September, which is a huge shift. We never typically see swings anywhere near that much in terms of seasonality. The real critical question is how much of that will stick once the crisis ends. I think people who've moved to Liverpool in normal times like the experience. They value the benefit they get, the reliability they get. I think a key challenge for us is right now is we could handle more. The restriction is the labour pool that's available, and you've got the trade-off between, do you go out, recruit people and train them for what might be a 2 or 3 month issue, or not? And that's our challenge right now. And of course, that's a really difficult point to answer right now. The feedback we're getting is very positive from people whose containers come through Liverpool. I would hope that this is an opportunity for many supply chains that are based in the north to use northern ports. And again, it's not just about Liverpool, it's about those ports up the east coast as well that can equally offer the country more resilience and supply chains more reliability.
Okay. Can I go to John Smith on this? Because what's interesting about the idea of moving to northern ports is the rail infrastructure, in my simple terms, John, generally runs south to north or north to south. It doesn't run that well east to west. So trying to service northern ports really efficiently across the country is much more of a challenge for the rail industry. What views do you have on this move to northern ports?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Frank. I mean, just to pick up on Stephen's point about once this crisis is over, I'm sure the current government will find the next crisis to foist on us, Stephen. So the boxes will be there for a bit longer yet. I think the point you make, though, Frank, is exactly that. There's been a lot of lobbying over the years from a rail freight perspective to invest money in the network rail infrastructure to support the key ports that are on, the southern tip and the eastern coast. So the Felixstows, the gateways, and the Southamptons. That's where most of the focus has been. Equally, I think some of the northern ports, rail hasn't featured as much as volumes have grown, because you need a certain criticality of size to make rail freight work from an intermodal point of view. So consequently, the facilities for rail within, and Seaforth that's outside Stephen's window is an example of it, haven't been developed either. But I think these things will take time. Rail as a solution can be very flexible. We were asked, Stephen and I were joking about the service we now run into Liverpool. I was asked on a Friday from a particular customer to operate it on the Monday, and we managed to do it by a Wednesday through huge effort of those at Peel and within GB Rail Freight as well. So the flexibility of rail is without question, but the limitations, 9'6" limitations or terminal limitations, that will take time, and it will need security of volume for the ports to put in capital into those bits of infrastructure. And indeed, it's hard enough to get 2 tracks on the Felixstowe branch line. So persuading Network Rail, as you well know, Frank, to start investing in more speculative rail freight capacity around ports that have less volume going through them is quite difficult. But I would say now, you chip away at these things slowly. You have to accept that rail investment is a piecemeal process, particularly on the freight side of things. I think for me, what I would like Network Rail to understand is what it is when it's all finished. You know, even Felixstowe and Eton, you know, it might take, as we call them, control periods, which are lumps of 5 years of investment. It might take 2 or 3 to complete that route, but there's no one with really strategic thought about what it should be. And I think the same applies across the Pennines, as you've seen, the toing and froing there. So you chip away at these things, and you understand that the funding isn't always there to create the capacity to serve the northern ports. But it would just be nice to know that there's an acceptance that that and that are the steps towards achieving the ultimate goal of the flexibility that we need. But I think it will come, and if the volumes stay in the way that Stephen has described his rise in demand, then that will start to stimulate the need for capital to be ploughed in either by the ports or by Network Rail.
And I think, and the questions there, I'm going to go to Gary, but my observation before I ask Gary to answer the question or respond to the question is that, you know, their CMA with a fantastic investment program of building 26 LNG ships, 20,000, 23,000 TEU of size. There's only certain places they can go to, subject to both the size of the vessel and even now the bunkering of the vessel. And this means there's winners and there's losers, and or maybe not losers, but not having the opportunity. And you know, this is a question that I know Gary probably has to deal with on many occasions, where the ports are trying to convince him to put more traffic through northern ports and the like, but they have their own needs and demands on what the investment is requiring to do. So what are your views, please, Gary, about this pressure to go to northern ports when you're building so many much larger ships again?
Sure. So I think for me, it's not necessarily about an alternative to southern ports, which is often the question we get drawn on. No, for me, it's about offering different options to customers based on their supply chain needs. So there are some customers where it absolutely makes sense for us to, you know, I wouldn't even call it feeder, I would call it more a relay product nowadays, where we look at a fixed service, you know, on a group ship, a group vessel to move from a main European port up to northwest or onto the east coast as well. I think there is certainly some more appetite for it, but again, I think it's about the fact that some customers that works on the basis of where their DCs are, on the basis of their restocking, on the basis of their flow into store, and for some it doesn't. For some, again, they need more flexibility to take into a southern port and hub. So the overriding thing for me is that we continue to invest and have as many options possible into the UK, because otherwise we do run the risk in the future, as you rightly challenge, Frank, that we become a country actually which relies purely on feeders, because some of these larger ships just are unable to operate, and we are some way from that for sure. But if we don't continue to invest and have these different options and make sure that we utilize them all and operate efficiently, then yes, it's certainly a challenge for us to continue to bring the larger vessels into the UK and operate them efficiently, for sure. I do want to emphasize, though, that we are talking about an unprecedented time, right, where we've seen demand, as I've said before, increase at a rate that nobody predicted and nobody could plan for. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that it might not, this is not for me the norm. And so, yes, absolutely, we need to look at alternatives, but we shouldn't judge the last 6 months on how we're going to be looking at the rest of the next 12.
And taking that point up there, Gary, about these extraordinary times, if we go back to 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis, it took 5 years for global trade to come back to the 2007 levels. I think we're facing a similar situation today, where unprecedented levels of business are taking place. But what might happen over the next 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 years in terms of sustaining levels of business that we might have been used to in 2019. That's going to be the interesting one. But then can I take the question also now to John, because of all of us, John has infrastructure and resources, both people and equipment, nearly in every port across the Great Britain. So if there's somebody who understands the movement of cargo from south to north or east to west, it's John. So can I have your observations about the northern ports question, please, John?
Well, I think we should have been called Martini instead of maritime, because anytime, any place, anywhere. And before somebody says our slogan should be service worth waiting for, I think we're much better than that. So, I mean, we've been going 20 years. We started with 5 depots, Manchester, Thamesport, Felixstowe, Southampton, and Tilbury. So we've now got over 30, and with 5 rail terminals, and we're operating 10 trains a day. And we've invested in all of the ports, and all of the ports clearly have a role in this. Well, the only place we're not at is Grangemouth, but watch this space, we hope. So there's clearly a role for all the ports, and like Gary, we want to give our customers every opportunity to work with us, if that's the right way to put it.
Okay, I love the Martini connection, John, because it would make me say to you, are you shaken or are you stirred? That's the one I want to know. But on that, John, when you've got all these assets around the country, you know yourself sometimes where logistics work better in some places than others. And is there a point where in certain locations you wish there was more volume going through because the efficiencies might be better there for the supply chain? And could that actually be, in certain cases, in northern ports where the opportunities might not be taken as much as you think they should be?
Well, if you look at sort of the effect on us with these big container ships, you know, the 26,000 TEU ships, and you know, the demand that they cause in terms of port infrastructure, deep water, big cranes like these behind me. But if you look at the effect on us, we see a big gap between the big ships. And when we see the big ships bunching, as 2 recently did in Southampton, and I know Mark Hooper is dialed in because he's been sending me rude messages on my iPhone. So, you know, when that happens, both events are really terrible. So in Southampton, we had so much business, we couldn't cope. And when we get a gap between them, our fleet is not so productive. So if you look at things another way, a daily feeder service of sort of 2,000 or 3,000, maybe that's too much, but say 500 to 700 boxes per feeder with each customer would give us a steady flow of business, and we could regulate that, and that would be, you know, that would be a great way to organize our business. Whereas at the moment, we get the 2 extremes.
Thank you, John. I hope, again, we've given some clues to how we're thinking about Northern Ports, Michael there. And Robert, can we have the next question, please?
Yes, this is from Eleanor Hadland, and I suspect that this might split the panel a bit. Is now the time for ports and inland terminals to look again at their pricing structures, given that the current market circumstances have resulted in rising costs with terminal service agreements, often meaning little or no flexibility to pass on in some increased costs. And I guess what then the question goes on, is this a pricing change or a matter of better defining normal service parameters?
Okay, I mean, I've got to take this question straight to Stephen, and the way he'll respond to it will lead to our other colleagues being brought into it to a lesser or greater extent. But the issue of pricing, Stephen, is falling onto your shoulders now.
Thanks for passing that one to me. Well, first, Frank. I think pricing's a really interesting one, and I was asked a very similar question this morning about pricing in the wider maritime and freight sector and its impact on GB economy. I think my perception is very broadly the costs running terminals, and I mean both the capital and the operating costs are broadly steady. I mean, sure, at the moment we're incurring significantly more overtime than we would plan, but equally there's more volume to pay for it. So from a cost of operation perspective, actually, I think having a stable set of prices negotiated with the various shipping line customers on an annual or biannual basis probably provides the market with the stability it needs without creating too much uncertainty. I think if we move to changing pricing on a shorter term basis, then you run the risk of in times like this, actually people being able to ratchet prices up and there being an accusation of exploiting the market. So I think the approach of setting prices so that people can plan against them is the right approach. I think there was a second part to that question though about what service people expect out of the terminals, and we took a conscious decision and we continue to take conscious decisions throughout the COVID crisis around our prioritisation. And our first priority was keeping our staff safe. Can we operate in a COVID secure way and maintain social distancing? And that was priority number one. And then priority number two is those customers who have been with us for some time, can we continue to give them a reliable service? And it's that understanding of service expectation that I think is one that might be worth some comment by colleagues on the panel. And I think whilst it would have been very easy for us to go out and aggressively secure more diversions and more ships, that would have probably put our service level at risk. And what we've chosen to do is take the capacity that we think we can cope with and try and hold our service levels together. And broadly, I'm not saying in every event, but broadly, I think the ports that we look after have generally done that. And for me, I think that's got to be the approach of terminal operators, whether at the coast or inland, is try and deliver what you promised as far as you can, given the external circumstances that Gary's already talked about.
Look, can I then pass that question to Gary, because of what people see the visibility of prices to some extent. With my past experience, it was more relative to how the shipping line approached it rather than the port approached it as a supplier to the line. Gary, please.
Yeah, so I think probably we can hold another webinar on pricing, right? So I'll keep it as brief as I can. I think again, we need to remember that this is a bit of a short-term phenomenon. So I will address freight rates because I'm sure it will come up as a question. You know, it's based on supply and demand, right? And that's how our industry has always worked. And actually, stability again is a positive for us. It allows us to be able to consider investments, because these are not short-term investments in our industry; they're long-term ones. And so, yes, I mean, indeed, there's been a number of short-term investments we've tried to make as well, and a number of additional costs when it comes to additional capacity, extra loaders. So again, I would just reiterate that it is based on supply and demand, and it has equally gone much lower in previous years to a point where it's not sustainable for us to invest. And I don't think that's good for anyone in the industry at all. When we can't invest in future products, and right now it's at a point where we can and we are able to offer what we can to customers to try and cater for their needs.
And for John Williams, when you come face to face with service reaching out of ports, and both and yourself as both Johns having pricing relationship with ports, how do you see the situation? And I'm going to John Williams first.
Well, as Gary said, you know, nothing is cheap, and the assets that we invest in are expensive and have a long-term life and require quite a lot of capital to acquire them. And you know, the business that we're all in is extremely competitive. So, you know, retailers tender their volumes every year. shipping lines do, 3PLs do. So, you know, over the last 20 years, you know, the number of tenders we've been involved in, and so we reflect in every bid, you know, efficiencies that we've made, costs that we've cut, productivity improvements. So there isn't much margin left because it is a competitive world. And if you, John Smith, I'm sure will concur that when you're running a fixed service between the Port of Felixstowe or Southampton or Gateway to an inland rail terminal, you know, the capital involved is colossal. And the break-even point on a locomotive, John, has got to be mid 80%, hasn't it? And so, you know, it's the last few boxes that actually create the margin for you to then to invest in, you know, assets like a rail terminal. That doesn't come cheap. You know, cranes, we're looking at 4 rail-mounted gantry cranes at East Midlands Gateway. They're £4.5 million a pop. To acquire land is expensive. To concrete land is, to that specification, is £600,000–700,000 an acre. So none of what we do is cheap. It's an asset-heavy, labour-intensive industry. And as Gary said, and as I think you just said, we want, or Stephen said, we want to create prices that people can plan against. And in the last several weeks, we could have taken huge advantage of the market with customers prepared to pay us, you know, £1,000 for a round trip Manchester. But we've turned them all down because we maintain the service and commitments to our existing customers.
John, do you want to make additional comments, John Smith?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd agree with a lot of what John has said. He's learning far too much about our industry far too quickly, which worries me. Yeah, you know, as far as pricing adjustments are concerned, we are but one part of that model. It's the one area where rail competes directly with road. There are other markets that we're in where it's more difficult for road to compete with us, and therefore pricing is more flexible. But we're not heading off with barrel loads of money. We are making enough to support the type of investment that John has said. And, you know, we can all throw numbers around, but if we're to buy a new bi-mode loco to move towards a decarbonised agenda, they're coming in at €6.5 million each. Again, maybe 10% more expensive if the pound depreciates again. But we compete very hard, and the key thing for us, and what has been very frustrating at the moment with demand being so high, is efficient utilisation of our assets is what we look for. We look to run the longest trains possible. We look to rotate the assets every day. We look to run them on Saturday. We'd run them on Sunday if we possibly could, and then we look for those that are supporting and supplying us to fill our trains. And that's when actually you can make quite a lot more money. That's when price can start to be adjusted. And we've seen that. John's right. You know, if you compare rail freight with passenger railways, which has been in a franchise model, levels, it's been shown many times through statistics that the productivity of our labour and the productivity of our rolling stock assets are light years ahead of the passenger rail. And that's been part of the problem, to unionise, you know, too much inflexibility within the workforce. But we've milked that thing dry now. The one bit of an opportunity that still arises where both ourselves and our customers can benefit is fill the trains every day fully to capacity, whether that be about pre-nomination, efficient operation of ports, more inland terminals. There's a number of elements that surround that, but there's still a major opportunity in that. We still run far too many trains, still loaded to 60, 70, 80% of their capacity. Fill that gap, and all of a sudden there's a lot more money coming into road.
That's a great point, John. Can I just make an observational point on this about pricing and the ports in the UK? I mean, the ports in the UK are principally in the private sector. And when we compare ports elsewhere around the world, they're principally in the state sector. So there's a huge difference. And also our rail, our road system is very much private sector led. And then we're an island and we've got more choice. We're not relying on one major port per se to bring product. Importers and shippers do have a degree of choice of where they want to route their cargo. Price probably in the UK port industry and UK shipping industry and rail industry and trucking industry is probably on a world benchmark, some of the most competitive in the world, and probably in many cases the most efficient. But it's right for Eleanor to raise the question about prices, and I hope some of the comments that were made today are of help to her. Can I have the next question, please, Robert?
Yes, this is a sort of combination of several people have asked questions about this. And it's really to do with the sustainability of ports and the greater supply chain. And I guess there's two parts to that. One is, the idea of using northern ports and different modal splits, and also alternative fuels. And obviously, Frank, you alluded to the new CMA vessels running on LNG. I guess the questions might also pertain to what options there might be for road and rail freight and so forth with regards to environmental sustainability.
Okay, sustainability and ports and the issues that we're dealing with now. I'm going to go to, I probably will go to Gary on this one to start with, because the decision that CMA have made in going to LNG ships, which is really setting the trend, will have repercussions right through the logistics chain. And also, when you look on the website of CMA, they've got various choices of whether you want this thing called positive effect or biofuels, and options that talk about environmental issues that a global transport company is offering. So if you don't mind, Gary, can I ask you to
Sure.
do some...
No, thanks, Frank, and I'm glad you brought it up. So obviously we've embarked on a series of LNG powered vessels, 23,000 TEUs to come in between now and 2022. And there's a lot of investment across the industry, across the shipping lines, in terms of trying to get to carbon neutral by 2050. I think most of us have actually committed to it. And that's fantastic for the future and the future of our children, our children's children, and rightly so, as a polluter in our world. So we have taken the bold step to be, I would say, a first mover. It means that the vessels we're operating now are reducing CO2 by 20% over and above many others. And actually not just the larger ones. So you mentioned container ships before. There are 1,400 TEU ships which have been delivered. And I think that's actually, for me, a really important step, because it means some of the discussions we've had today around these relay or feeder products, we can offer them in a sustainable way in the future as well, which is really important if we're going to be able to offer these diverse products that we spoke about. I think it is more and more, it's been a discussion for many years. It's higher on the agenda of more customers than we've ever seen before. It is, again, significant investment, one that we've been prepared to take, again, to really set the ball rolling. There are many different research is going on to other alternative fuels as well. I don't think LNG will be the ultimate end game, but it's certainly the start of the transition. So yeah, we welcome it, and we welcome everybody else to continue to invest in it as well. And I think it's about time that the shipping industry went down this road.
Okay. Because thank you, Gary, because really, to some extent, how the shipping lines take a lead in the environmental issues does cascade down as much as, and I'm going to go to Stephen now, is that the ports themselves in the UK have traditionally, and I could go back in my time at Mersey Docks, we introduced wind turbine generation, 20 years ago nearly. And so it's a conscious effort with how it's all joined up with the shipping lines and with the hauliers and with the train companies. So could I have some comments from you, please, Stephen?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's sort of two elements to that question. I think number one is about enabling the most efficient mode of transport. So we know from data that on a ton-kilometre basis, maritime is generally better than rail, which is generally better than road. So again, I think it comes back in part to some of the routing conversations that we had earlier on in the conversation, and to choose the most efficient mode of transport. But then, of course, there's no point in CMA investing in the more efficiently fueled vessels if the UK doesn't have that product supply. There's been a lot of chat around Scottish ferries being powered by LNG, and the LNG is then sourced from Zeebrugge, is the current planning assumption. So you've got to put the right supplies in place, and that has to be incumbent on the port authority, working in combination with the shipping lines and also in combination with the hauliers as well. And certainly we're now starting seeing moves with the city regions as well in the areas that we operate, who are keen to explore clean air strategies and promote more environmentally friendly fuels in their regions. And for me, it's about bringing that port community together. So it's not just the port authority, it's the shipping lines and the hauliers agreeing what that fuel of choice is, and then looking at how it can be efficiently supplied. We talked about our respective hairlines before. I think most of us on the panel can remember the days of Betamax videos. And I think right now there is a fear by many in the industry, if you commit too much capital to one fuel of choice, it might be the Betamax. And so you've got to create that decision about what's the fuel of the future. As Gary was saying, LNG might be a fuel for the next 10 to 15 years, but that's sufficient for investment whilst we spend the time understanding what that zero carbon fuel is for 2030, 2040 and 2050. But it's got to be that port community working together, so you get the density of volume that supports the investment that then makes it happen.
And I'm going to go to John Smith now, because in the last answer that you gave, John, you really hit a very, very important point about sustainability and efficiency goes with the optimum use of your assets. And so if you could maybe just add a bit to that before then go on to John, because John, with his trucking hat on, will have a lot of initiatives to deal with, as well as regulatory issues to deal with in terms of sustainability. But can you just carry on with your other point, please, John?
Yeah, no problem, Frank. I mean, just to throw in that rail freight is, of course, the most sustainable mode of transport. So these lorry drivers, where John comes from, it has to be the future, and even he's realised that now. So, but yeah, it's about efficient utilisation of assets. I always think that as far as rail freight's concerned, I like to manage most of the risk myself. I find when you're dependent on third parties to manage your risk, it can be you that loses out, the rail freight operator. We're piggy in the middle, for want of a better description. So it's a lot easier for us in the aggregates markets, where we fill wagons to their full level, and a single customer contracts us for that volume. And the more that we can get in per train, then the more money we make, or the cheaper the price becomes. And intermodal has always been about that. We're looking ourselves, and this is about investing capital in fact, we've ordered equipment which more suits the 40-foot, 9'6" box, so that we're not so dependent, because for those that don't know, rail freight wagons historically have always been 60 feet long, so 3 TEU, and finding the last TEU to put on those wagons has been difficult, unless you are in the Midlands markets with a lot of scrap going out or whatever else it might be. And again, rail suits that, because heavy rail is, we can shift that volume quite easily. But we will get a degree of capacity that is missing, just purely because you can't get the 20-40-foot mix. So we're investing in assets, things called triples, EcoFrect triples, which are 40-foot flat wagons. We've got 84 of the things coming starting in the new year, and they will slowly cascade into our services and allow us to get more TU on each train. What then we need, and what are the question marks, although Gary reassures me a little, is we need the demand to be there, which it has been there, but then it's going to become very demanding of the ports to act efficiently in loading of those trains. Because if you just compare a 60-foot train over the same length with a train full of these new wagons, you're adding 20% volume on these things because of the way that they work. So we're looking for efficient utilization of that capacity. But I think we will get there. I think there's a natural intent to get there, and we can find more paths on the network. We can run more trains. the port at Felixstowe, you know, they invested hugely in the rail freight terminals there, that we can get more capacity in that are longer trains. So gently it's being chipped away at. And I think the realization of efficient use of rail is beginning to dawn on people at the moment.
Thank you, John. And to John Williams. John, you've always been at the last end of the chain from the ports in the greater sense. I know that John, with his trains, is taking more and more freight off-road, but the trucking industry is still going to be so important to us going forward, and finding sustainability that complements the ports, that complements the initiatives of the ships, is really important to us. And how do you see the future in relation to the question, John?
Well, if you look at the current situation, there are about 5,000 trucks a day coming and going from the port of Felixstowe, 2,500 from Southampton, and about 1,500 from London Gateway. So the Felixstowe trucks congest the A12 and the A14, and the London Gateway trucks the M25, and the Southampton trucks the M3, because these trucks are typically going 3 to 4 hours to reach their destinations, because the ports are in the south, or the deep sea ports are in the south, and the market is in the Midlands or the north. And there has to be a coordinated way where we create more rail capacity. As John mentioned, the Felixstowe-Nuneaton line is desperate. The branch line between Felixstowe and Ipswich, I mean, that's taken longer than the Good Friday Agreement to put in place. And there are so many other things which are slow, but you've got to coordinate it all. And I think that, speaking as, you know, the largest container transport company in the country, and aspiring to be the biggest rail company as well, John Smith, we need to encourage more of the containers to go by rail. And I think the way that we do that is by, so at the moment, we pay over £1 million a year to the port of Felixstowe or Southampton or Gateway to strip and load a train, and shunting and all of the palaver that goes on. We spend about £350,000 a year at an inland terminal. And so there are about 70 intermodal services in the country, roughly. So the ports are earning £70 million a year. And we, as freight operating companies, are it's costing us £70 million a year. The total subsidy available to us as an industry through what's called modal shift revenue support, I think it should be called miserable shift revenue support, because it's only about £20 million, and there has to be 10 freight operating companies applying for this tiny amount of money, and we're spending 70 million to the ports to get. I'm not saying the ports don't deserve it, but it leaves very little behind, and road haulage gets a free pass. So rail pays 70 million, road pays nothing. So as the country's biggest container transport haulier, you heard it here first, I think that cargo moving by road over, say, 120 miles, 110 miles, should carry a climate levy charge, and the ports should be allowed to keep that, and rail should get the free pass.
John, that's such an interesting concept that you know, that could have a seminar just on its own about that initiative that you're talking about, which I know you feel very passionate about. And I don't want to deflect from that. I just want to ask a question. In terms of trucking, what fuel do you think will be the future for the trucking industry? Because no matter how much rail you do, you still need a truck at the other end to move the cargo.
Yeah, well, we operate at the 26-ton payload, 44-ton gross vehicle weight. So we're at the highest weights on British roads. So the kind of battery that would be required to power, you know, that kind of vehicle would be huge, and it would probably take 4 or 5 tons off the payload, which is how a lot of hauliers get paid. And also electric power delivers high levels of torque to the drive axle. So 0 to 60 could be achieved in less than 4 seconds. I don't think we want our trucks doing that. So one of the manufacturers that we source a lot of our trucks from is Scania, and I trust them hugely. We spend massive amounts of money with Scania. And just before lockdown, my last trip was to Stockholm, and they unveiled the construction of a new foundry to build the next generation of diesel engines. So a new foundry is probably a 30, 40-year payback. So clearly somebody like Scania see at the heavy end, diesel engines, and they're getting better and they're getting cleaner. But if you were to ask me which, and over the next 10 years, it could be huge advances. But I think it'll be hydrogen that is the alternative fuel of choice. And what they need to do is to find a way of directly injecting it from a reservoir, say a tank, into the engine. At the moment, it has to go over a cell, and that's where you get a lot of cost, a lot of space. So, but look at the advances in battery technology. It's been fantastic. So over the next 10 years, we could see huge advances in hydrogen power as well.
Okay. I'm very conscious, thank you, John. I'm very, very conscious of time now. And I'll pass now, pass over to Robert.
Yes, I was hoping we might get one more question in about Freeport, but that will have to come another time, I'm afraid. That was fascinating, and also one of the funniest webinars I think I've never seen so much laughter. So, gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. I hope you really enjoyed that. I know that there are lots of questions still to post. I'm going to circulate those to our panel, and hopefully we'll get some thoughts back from them, and I'll be able to pass that on. It just falls to me to thank Gary Jeffries from CMA, Stephen Carr from Peel Ports, John Williams from Maritime Transport, John Smith from GB Rail Freight, and of course Frank Rowbottom for moderating it. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.